Hello and welcome to Theology Dive. Today we're presenting an academic presentation I did in partial fulfillment for my graduate degrees. And so, again, as always, if you like the content, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Take care. Hello everybody, my name is Patrice Petel and this is my third academic presentation, and today's subject is a defense of free will. One of the important aspects in apologetics is the question of why is there so much evil in the world? In other words, what would be a good theodicy or a good defense against this problem that evidently pervades in this world, in this fallen world? So, one of the main aspect of Christian thought has been the free will theodicy or the free will defense. So, in introduction today, I would like to read a quote from John Lennox in his book, Determined to Believe. John Lennox will say, most humans rank freedom among the highest of ideals. Freedom, we feel, is every human being's birthright. None has the right to deprive us of it against our will, except, of course, in cases of proven criminality. Even to attempt to remove someone's freedom is regarded as a crime against the essential dignity of what it means to be human. Indeed, we consider this as an important ideal, and I believe that one of the reasons we feel that way as human beings is because this is part of our God-given image-bearing aspect. Indeed, one of the long-standing aspects of Christian thought is the claim that free will is a key element in the Christian understanding of the problem of evil. Indeed, Indeed, in the early 1940s, C.S. Lewis argued that if God thought that the state of war that pervades the universe was a price worth paying for free will, for making a world in which creatures could do real good or real harm, then we may take it as it is worth paying. So the free will theodicy is an important aspect of Christian thinking about evil. And today, my objective today is to give a defense of the free will premise of the free will defense. So, I have two aims in this presentation today. My first aim is to present a defense of the free will premise, and secondly, offer a rational justification to the essential premise to any free will theodicy, that is the existence of free will. So we must understand my objective today, my aim for this presentation. I really want to address the foundation, or give a rational justification to the free will premise for the free will defense. Now, first of all, my first aim for the outline of this presentation, I will give clarification of the concepts. I will give the reasons why free will is an important aspect, why free will is worth wanting. I will present some philosophical objections to free will. I will present some scientific objections to free will. And finally, I will present theological objections to free will. And to each of these objections, I will offer an answer. I will give an answer for these objections, an answer that wants itself to be a defense. So it may not be a definitive answer, but given that there is an answer to these, then these no longer cause a problem, I feel, because we can give a rational justification against these so-called arguments against the existence of free will. So to begin, let's start with concept clarification. So what will we be talking about today? What will we be talking about today? Obviously, we'll be talking about the problem of free will, and we'll see that the concept of free will is possibly the most difficult problem in philosophy. And whether or not it is certainly one of the most gripping problems. The idea that human beings have free will goes back to antiquity with the debates, the arguments that the Greek philosophers were having. So this is not a recent problem. And this problem of free will, whether or not free will exists, has been an ongoing argument for millennia. Now, if we look at the question of free will, well, it is pervasive. I've studied formal education in marketing. I've studied in biology. I've studied in all these spheres. I'm a teacher. I have a master's in teaching education. And in all these spheres of study, I encountered the idea of free will. In marketing, we explored why do consumers act as they do? What provides the basis of their choices when they buy something? What is the basis of consumer behavior? This is what we study in marketing to promote sales. As a teacher, I studied different aspects of how can we best teach things to students. I've studied the Pygmalion effect, how the way that I perceive my students has an impact on student learning. These are all integrated. These are all aspects, practical aspects to the question of free will. So there are two views concerning free will. First of all, there's the classical view, and the classical view can be described like this: with respect to a contemplated future act, we simultaneously have both the following abilities: the ability to perform that act and the ability to refrain from performing that act. This entails that we have been in the following position. For something we did do, we were at some point prior to our doing it able to refrain from doing it and able not to do it. This means what? This means that for a given antecedent situation, a state of affairs, up to my taking a decision, given the same state of affair prior to that decision making, I have the ability either to take that decision or to refrain from taking that decision. So it's called the principle of alternate possibilities. So I have both possibilities are before me, either to do or refrain from doing. Now this is the classical view of free will. There is also another idea that is attached to the concept of free will, a different understanding of free will, which is the source view. Now, the source view says this: the agent must be the ultimate source of his actions. That is, what we do is wholly and entirely up to us in some absolute buck-stopping way. So for everything I do, I have the ultimate responsibility for my decision. I cannot blame anything else on my doing on my taking that decision. So in a buck-stopping way, what I do is up to me. So this is the source view of free will. And we can see in studying the literature that these are not two mutually exclusive understanding of free will. Obviously, if I have the ability to do otherwise, and it's up to me to do otherwise or not. So both are complementary rather than mutually exclusive. in my mind, in my understanding. Okay. Now, another thing we'll be looking at in terms of the concepts we will be addressing today is the idea of incompatibilism. What is incompatibilism? Well, incompatibilism is whether one's understanding of free will in the classical or in the source view is free will incompatible with determinism. So we're talking about the incompatibility of free will and determinism. Are those aspects, is free will mutually exclusive with determinism? So can I be determined and have free will or not? So this has come to be understood as libertarian free will, meaning that if I have libertarian free will, I am not determined to take an action. So it is an incompatibilist view of free will. Later on today, we'll look at the compatibilist view of free will, meaning that free will and determinism are compatible one with another. Indeed, we could see that determinism is subdivided in two classes. So determinism can be subdivided in two elements, either hard determinism or compatibilism, which is oftentimes called soft compatibilism. Soft compatibilism. So on determinism or compatibilism, every human action, i.e. raising one's hand to vote, is causally necessitated by events that obtained prior to the action, including events that existed before the person acting was even born. That is, human actions are mere happenings. They are part of a causal chain of events that lead up to them in a deterministic fashion. So one example of a causal change is dominoes. So dominoes is an example of a causal chain. So you have here dominoes, and we'll look here at an interesting little clip from a domino. So as we see here, we have a domino effect. All these dominoes start falling with the fall of only one domino. And it has ongoing effects leading up to what may be outrageous consequences. But you see, on compatibilism, human beings, you can see all the different colors of dominoes here, could be considered either as different human beings acting, or within one human being, all the different aspects of the person, be it the biochemical aspect of the human, everything, the neurons functioning, all fit in a causal chain. So, and everything is linked to other causal event prior to that action. So, in this view, human actions are seen as mere happenings, just events caused by prior events. They are just the consequences of prior causes. So this either on hard determinism or on soft determinism or compatibilism, as it is also known, everything is seen as mere happenings. And the essential difference between hard compatibilism and soft compatibilism is not the determinism, because both are completely deterministic worldviews. The only thing is, because one of these dominoes here has the perception, a caused perception. It's also part of the cause and effect relationship. It's a causal chain that produces this perception that he is responsible for the action. This mere perception is deemed enough to be said to be free will. So this is part of the causal chain. and it's only a difference of point of view. So if we go back here, so we have determinism and hard determinism, compatibilism. I don't know if you see it. Could you check if you can see the... That is better. Thank you. Okay, so you have hard determinism, compatibilism. Now, the only difference is a point of view shift. The only difference is a point of view shift, because all in all, the chain of events, the causal chain, is the same in both hard determinism and soft determinism. But for some reason, the fact that this causal chain produces in the domino the perception that he is responsible for acting is enough to be said to be free will. So perhaps this, and to me, to my mind, this does not make sense, to my mind. But it's not because I don't see it making sense that it does indeed or not make sense. Let's go forward. So, but is free will something worth having? Wouldn't it be sufficient? Wouldn't compatibilism be sufficient? The mere fact that I feel that I am responsible for my action, wouldn't that be simply merely sufficient? I believe it was Dennett Daniel Dennett that said this. He is an atheist that promotes compatibilism in an atheistic worldview. In one of his books, I forget the name of the book, but he asked the question, what kind of free will is worth wanting? What kind of free will is worth wanting? And is libertarian free will something that is worth wanting rather than having this compatibilistic freedom? So, things worth wanting. Amidst of all these things I could argue for that would be worth wanting on libertarian free will and that are not available in compatibilistic free will, there are three that I will be mentioning today. First of all, there is the idea that genuine creativity and true novelty. Genuine creativity and true novelty. We must understand that on compatibilism or hard determinism, there is no genuine creativity in human beings because everything is part of the causal chain. So whatever I produce, this production today of my academic presentation is merely the outcome of a causal chain of event that occurred prior to my doing this presentation. And I did not do anything of my own. I was not the source of anything in this. Everything is determined by prior events. So there is no genuine creativity, no songwriter, no artist, there's nothing. Nothing is from somebody. There is no trademark. There's no possible trademark, because everything is part of the causal chain of events. There is also no true novelty. I might write a novel, but I didn't really not write it. It didn't emanate from me. It's merely a consequence of the causal chain of events that prior to that, to my writing the novel. Secondly, there is moral responsibility. Moral responsibility. Many people indeed think that compatibilism is sufficient to account for moral responsibility. So the mere fact that the causal chain of event produce a feeling in the individual that he was or she was responsible for doing the crime or doing that reprehensible act is sufficient to attribute moral responsibility. This means that if this is so, and theologically speaking, we must remember that many Calvinists have this idea of compatibilistic free will. Well, obviously, if this if the sole responsibility of the agent, if the mere perception that I am responsible for acting, this mere perception is sufficient to attribute responsibility. That means that the person believing in Christ can attribute to himself 100% of the responsibility for accepting Christ. So it's no longer God, it's the person, because the mere subjective feeling is sufficient to attribute responsibility. But I don't think that is sufficient in the Calvinistic worldview, because Calvinism wants to have this monergism, so it's only God acting. Well, monergism cannot function under compatibilism, because the mere fact of feeling responsible for an action gives you moral responsibility for that action. That means that you are responsible for what you do. That means you're responsible for believing. So, in other words, on Calvinism, the only way one can attribute 100% to God is on hard determinism. But I'm going too fast. We'll see that later on today. All right. So moral responsibility. We must understand that moral responsibility, free will, is the we must understand. I think I go. And the third thing that is good, that is worth wanting, is true human rationality. I believe I went too fast here. Yes. Genuine creativity and true novelty. Determinism, that's Karl Popper, the great philosopher of science, who said this. Determinism destroys in particular the idea of creativity. It reduces to a complete illusion the idea that in preparing this lecture, I have used my brain to create something new. Moral responsibility. I'm sorry. Yes. Given that actions and decisions are mere happenings, personal creativity and true novelty are impossible and are the mere effect of prior causal forces. Concerning moral responsibility, libertarian free will is intrinsic to the very notion of moral responsibility. That is, a person cannot be held morally responsible for an act unless he or she was free to perform that act and free to refrain from it. This is a basic moral intuition, and we do not believe there are any relevant moral convictions more basic than this one. That could serve as a premise to prove it. I believe this was Jerry Walls that mentioned this in his book, Why I'm Not Calvinist. And I think that he is completely right. It is a basic moral intuition, so much so that the whole justice system in America, in Canada, in the West, and I'm sure I haven't studied law elsewhere, but I've read enough in terms of American law, Canadian law, even in Europe, British law, French law. The basic moral intuition is that if you meant something, if you meant to act such a way, if you are free to do or free not to do, this basic moral intuition is fundamental in our criminal justice system. Indeed, the American criminal justice system largely relies on the notion that individuals are responsible for their action and thus can be punished when they choose to violate societal standards. In other words, American criminal jurisprudence is firmly rooted in the concept of individual free will. And this is, like I said, this is not just true in America, true in Canada, true in Britain, true in most of the world. Excuse me. More on this. Belief in determinism is highly correlated with lack of integrity. And these are studies, many studies are made, which are interesting. 2012 study shows that there is a high correlation in reduced self-control and weakened belief in a weakened belief in free will. What they did in this study was having the people that were interviewed read scientific text claiming that free will was an illusion, and after this, they gave questionnaires on how they would act. And they followed these folks after this, and they did this study on the effect of a perceived weakened free will, and there was a correlation with reduced self-control. 2009 study and a 2010 study, similar parameters, showed that an individual who believed in determinism were more likely to engage in antisocial behavior. Were more likely to engage in antisocial behavior. Interestingly, more on this, belief in free will supports convictions about non-conformity and personal moral responsibility reflected in increased conscientiousness and in the workplace and in parenting, together with a heightened sense of justice. Alexander, great book, Genes, Determinism, and God, Cambridge University Press. What it says that they correlated people who believed in free will, believed in personal responsibility and libertarian free will, that their choices were up to them in a buck-stopping way. The belief in free will supports convictions about non-conformity and personal moral responsibility, reflected in an increased conscientiousness. Sorry, that's a difficult word for me to say. Conscientiousness in the workplace, meaning they were more professional. They did what they had to do in the workplace. They were responsible in the workplace, and in parenting. So they took their parenting job seriously, together with a heightened sense of justice. So for them to be upright, morally upright, was important. So there is a link. There is definitely a link between belief in free will and how you act. There's a correlation anyways. Now, so we have seen the question of true novelty, creativity. We have seen the question of moral responsibility. There is also an interesting link between free will and true human rationality. True human rationality. Indeed, up to usness is essential for humans to have true rationality. On determinism, one has to believe that the reason he has come to believe something is simply that he was determined to do so. If determinism is true, there is no rational basis to affirm something, and the mere attempt to establish determinism logically refutes determinism. So, again, like we said concerning creativity, everything is based on prior causal chain. Even my quote-unquote logical processes in my mind, merely causal chain of event. I did not reflect, I did not really personally think these things. These are just the outcome of a causal chain of event. I might be wrong, I might be true, doesn't matter, because it's only a causal chain of event that goes through me and through all my processes, internal processes, from my digestion to my thinking to my everything is mere causal chain. So there's no true rationality possible. Obviously, we come now to the objections to free will. There are several. The main objections are the philosophical objections. Reason being, I mentioned earlier the philosophical debates in antiquity. Well, philosophy has been the main battleground in terms of, do we have free will or don't we? And essentially, it can be summarized in this way. So we have this mountain here, schematized mountain, and it is the incompatibilist mountain. So if we feel that determinism is true, perhaps we can go up the mountain, and this is the ascent problem facing those who believe in free will. So can we answer the objections against free will? If not, then we are definitely determinist. But then there's the descent problem, which means that is free will incompatible with indeterminism? So we are stuck between a rock and a hard place. Either because hard determinism, there's no place for free will. But if determinism is not, if free will is not compatible with determinism, is it compatible with indeterminism? Because if we are in terms of indeterminism, then everything is up to luck, to chance, to mere chance. So in other words, if an action occurred by virtue of an undetermined event in the brain, it would more likely diminish rather than enhance our freedom and control, and hence our responsibility. Such actions would be arbitrary, capricious, random, irrational, uncontrolled, inexplicable, or mere matters of chance or luck, and hence could not be free and responsible choices. So, if under indeterminism, it's mere luck. So there's no more free will under indeterminism than there is on determinism. So again, free willers like myself, are stuck between a rock and a hard place. Free will is not compatible with determinism, and free will is not compatible with indeterminism. Or is it? Well, since antiquity, free will was seen as a tertium quid, a third thing, beyond chance and necessity, beyond indeterminism and determinism. So, meaning that although we thought we were facing a dilemma, either determinism or indeterminism, well, we cut the horn of the dilemma and say, no, it's a third thing. It's a third thing. It's self-determinism, self-determination. And so, in antiquity, this third thing was identified as a kind of autonomous or spontaneous agency. So this self-determinism is seen as agency. I, as the agent, is acting, is doing something, is making choices. Oops, sorry. So, since antiquity, free will was seen as a tertium quid, I said it. This third thing, okay, Aristotle called it what depends on us, as opposed to what depends on chance, okay, or on necessity, okay. So it is not up to chance, not up to determinism, it's up to me to make choices. So this has been going through since Aristotle. So even Aristotle, I thought of this tertium quid, this third thing that could explain free will. And so the ascent problem and the descent problem is simply merely positing a false dilemma. And to cut the horn, we say, no, there is a third thing, there is agency. We'll develop this further when we talk about the scientific objections. We'll look at this when we look at the quantum indeterminacy. Okay, so scientific objections to free will. Modern science has adopted naturalism as a philosophical foundation, or at best as a methodological one. This means that on naturalism, human actions are mere natural events, mere natural happenings that are part of a causal chain of events that lead up to them in deterministic fashion. So, my action on naturalism is merely determined by past natural events. It is merely a chain of event, exactly like we mentioned earlier on determinism. So, naturalism is basically, or has been basically, naturalistic for a long time. Because rejecting anything that was supernatural, like the soul, like the human spirit, human soul, they could say, well, no, it's the human being is merely part of the causal chain of events of nature. So everything he does is part of this deterministic system. So humans, like dominoes, are agents through which causal chains runs to produce natural happenings that are described as human actions. So what we're doing, they're just chain of events, just deterministic events. We describe them as human action. We describe them as human choices. But in reality, this is fiction. This is an illusion. In reality, everything is determined. Well, this was true under the old mechanic, the old scientific mechanic, and under positivism and all these philosophical scientificism. Before the advent of quantum mechanics and the interpretation of quantum indeterminacy, okay, the human actions were seen as in this causal chain of events. It is still viewed a lot like this, but with the advent of quantum mechanics, things have changed a little bit. And this is often an argument that will be mentioned. What about quantum mechanics? Well, quantum mechanics is a theory of the atom that is perhaps one of the most successful scientific theory in the history of science. So QM is indeed a very successful theory. It enables scientists to make amazing predictions as to the behavior of the atom and atomic particles. It is very it's amazing how accurate it can be, and yet it is highly indeterministic, or at least the Copenhagen interpretation, which is the mainstream interpretation of quantum mechanics, is highly indeterministic. So the standard interpretation is called the Copenhagen interpretation, which today is mostly regarded as synonymous with indeterminism. Back to the descent problem. So with quantum mechanics, we're back to the descent problem in our incompatibilistic mountain we saw earlier. So if indeed quantum mechanics, these atoms going on in our brain, bring in indeterminism, we are no more free, because now our actions are basically random. Okay, so we're again back to the rock and a hard place. So if indeed quantum mechanics is such an explanatory power, and if indeed these quantum events in the brain bring in indeterminacy, then my actions are random. So I don't have free will. So between determinism of classical and relativistic mechanics and the indeterminism of quantum mechanics, the doctrine of free will faces a double whammy and is mostly considered as discredited by science. Why? But again, like I said, the descent problem. Randomness, either the ancient chance or modern quantum indeterminacy in the mind in a way that breaks. So how could we answer this? Compatible with indeterminism? Well, some have suggested, and I think it is an interesting defense of this idea, going back to the third thing that Aristotle posited. The thing is that randomness, either ancient chance or modern quantum indeterminacy, in the mind, in a way that breaks the causal chain of events, the causal chain of strict physical determinism, while doing no harm to responsibility. Meaning that, in a sense, this indeterminism could act as a buffer that would stop the causal chain of event, and this indeterminacy could provide a neutral ground over which humans can make actions, can take free will decisions. So we have this here, this little clip. If you look at the fire going, and then this little kid there moves away, so the causal chain of event is broken. So this was taken from the social distancing for the COVID-19 virus, but I thought it was appropriate as an image for what I was trying to illustrate, meaning that the quantum indeterminacy in the brain could act as a buffer that would stop the causal chain, and me as an agent starts a new causal chain by the decision I make. So everyone, obviously, there are some decisions I will be making that are perhaps deterministic. I just react to the environment. I'm cold. I will start to shiver. This is biological reaction to the environment. And perhaps if I burn myself, automatically my reflex will take away my hand because of the chain from the sensitive nerve to the motor nerve going through the spine. And this is obviously cause and effect chain. But when once the nerve impulse makes a U-turn to move my hand, the reflex action, part of the neural flux is the neural the impulse goes to the brain, from where I can make a free will decision after this. Oftentimes, I remember I was walking with I took a hot pan, and my dog was there, and if I had let go of the hot pan, it would have fallen on my dog. I didn't. I put the pan back. I was able to control my reflex action so as not to burn my pet. I burned myself, but oh well, I saved my dog. Okay, so what about, and now we saw the old mechanic, so a classical mechanic. We could have gone through and looked at relativistic mechanics. We looked at quantum mechanic. Well, more recently at least, free will has also undergone another whammy from the field of neurosciences. Because in the 70s, the first significant research study on the brain was able to offer a correlation between neuroscience and free will. This was pioneered by a guy called Benjamin Libet. Very interesting work. You should, if you are interested in this, read his work. Is interesting. Who had been studying the sensory threshold and the readiness potential. Meaning, at one point, what is the sensory threshold so that I can act? I can do something. The brain exhibited an initiating process beginning 550 milliseconds before the freely voluntary act. But awareness of the conscious will to perform the act appeared only 150 or 200 milliseconds before the act, which means that the voluntary process is initiated unconsciously some 400 milliseconds before the subject becomes aware of her free will or intention to perform the act. Meaning that unconsciously, I take a decision 400 milliseconds before consciously realizing I'm taking the decision. So folks, I've been saying, you see, we don't have free will. Because we initiate the free will 500 milliseconds before doing the decision. So this is particularly difficult in terms of what do we do with this, in terms of the brain. Well, first of all, we could go on and say that human being, we could go and explore the model of the unconscious and conscious mind, that everything is part of the conscious of the person. Some studies show that at any given moment we can only have 7 plus or minus 2 chunks of information at a time in our conscious awareness. Meaning that, and the brain makes decisions all the time. We make decisions all the time without necessarily being conscious of them. So this, folks will say, well, if this is true, we don't have free will because we're not making conscious decision. Well, yes and no. Look at this, and it's very interesting. Again, this led many in the scientific community to consider the subjective experience of freedom as no more than an illusion, and that our actions were initiated by unconscious mental processes long before we become aware of our intention to act. Now, this is interesting because this goes really we're hitting the nerve here, so if we want. Elsewhere, Libet, so the same author, same scientist, says the experience of the conscious intention to act would, in these terms, arise as a secondary outcome of the prior unconscious initiating process. Nevertheless, and this is important, nevertheless, it could still have a role either in completing the initiating process, conscious trigger, or in blocking its progression, veto it. So remember my analogy with I took the hot pan, and my reflex action was to just let go of it, but I kept it because I didn't want to burn my dog. Well, this is exactly what it's saying here. It's in that 400 millisecond, I can act on the initiating process, or I can refrain from acting on that initiating process. So you see, I can still. So somebody said that perhaps we don't have free will, we have free won't. But it's the same thing. We still can either complete the process or refrain from completing the process. And so we're still in control. I can still say no. So in front of, if I have several options before me and this 400 milliseconds there, if I say no to this one, all the other options are on go. Okay. So, and this is in Benjamin Libet, Unconscious Cerebral Initiative and the Role of Conscious Will in Voluntary Action. Behavioral and Brain Sciences, 1985. I believe, if I remember correctly, his prior study was in 83, his paper. And that dates from 85. So its further study showed that human beings did indeed have vetoing power over this in that 400 millisecond lapse of time. Okay. Now, obviously, there are theological objections. Not even one early church father writing from 95 to 430 CE, despite abandoned acknowledgement of inherited human depravity, considered Adam's fall to have erased human free choice to independently respond to God's gracious invitation. Augustine brought a veritable paradigm shift in early Christianity. What this is saying is that from the early church on, the writings of the early church, every author believed that human beings had free will. And it was part of the free will defense, of a free will theodicy. The reason there was evil is because human beings and angels could take free will decision. So, but it was Augustine who brought this paradigm shift in the early church and brought about the Western understanding of determinism, divine determinism. So, a scriptural basis. There's an interesting passage here in 1 Corinthians 7:37 that says, "But he that standeth steadfast in his heart, having no necessity, but hath power as touching his own will, and has determined this in his own heart, to keep his own virgin daughter, shall do well." So 1 Corinthians 7:37. So what we have here in this passage, we have the absence of necessity. We have the exercising of the power of self-determination. So this verse is interesting because it shows the basic elements of libertarian free will. So absence of necessity, source view, power over so again, the ability to do otherwise. Either he can have his daughter married or not. He can keep her a virgin if he decides to. Obviously, this is talks about the morality of the situation. Can the father, well, at that time in that culture, had enough control over his daughter's behavior? So this is not also, well, see, you don't have free will. No, this is a cultural environment in which a daughter would respect her father's wishes. Obviously, she could disregard it, pay the consequences, and go with her lover if that was her choice. But normally, if she respected the cultural environment, she would respect her father's desire, her father's decision. So, nevertheless, in this passage, we do have the absence of necessity, and we do have the exercising of the power of self-determination. People will also say, we'll give the example of Edwardian compatibilism. Jonathan Edwards, in his book, one common form of theological determinism, it was what has been called Edwardian compatibilism. On this view, willing or choosing is seen as equivalent with one's strongest inclination or preference. And since choosing is merely a prevailing inclination, all choices, therefore, are necessarily determined. So, Jonathan Edwards believed that we only act on our strongest desires, and any decision amounted to just following one's desire, one's inclination, strongest desire. Well, obviously, if we will go back earlier to when we talked about the problem that determinism would give to human rationality, well, this is a good example here. Because once once the compatibilist claims that he can exercise his reason, what he really means is that his reason is simply his greatest desire. But if choices are always and only aimed at the target of a person's greatest desire, they are never aimed at the target of truth. You can never have knowledge as justified true belief, as JTB. So, essentially, if Edwards is right, he's wrong. He is trying to prove determinism, and as we mentioned earlier, the mere fact of trying to prove determinism, logically prove determinism, well, you refute it because it's a self-contradiction. It's only Edwards' greatest desire that determinism be true. It's not rational. So what we saw today, well, we had two aims. We want to present a defense of the free will and offer a rational justification to the essential premise to any free will theodicy, the existence of free will. So we offered reasons why free will was worth wanting, and explain how under determinism, basically, if you wanted to prove to prove rationally determinism, you ended up refuting it because it was self-refuting. So we offered a rebuttal to hard determinism, which is the ascent problem, and we also offered a rebuttal to the descent problem, saying that obviously, if indeed there is this problem of indeterminacy, well, it offers a buffer over which human decisions can be taken. So essentially, we did present a defense of free will by facing the objections and answering these objections. So we faced the problem of the incompatibility between free will and determinism, and we answered the descent problem of the incompatibility between free will and indeterminism, meaning that indeterminacy does not cause problem for libertarian free will. So on this, God bless you, and I hope you enjoyed this.